Hi, I'm Carol Lesser. I'm the Executive Director of the Wilson Bruce Evans Home Historical Society. And as I have been saying for the past 4 years, and will probably be continuing for the next 2 years, we are rehabilitating the Wilson Bruce Evans House to open it to the public as a historic site and educational center. It's been a longer trip than we thought. And before I go much further, I want to give a shout out in particular to the Nord Family Foundation, who has been from the beginning one of our stalwart funders, and we certainly have over the years appreciated all they have done for us. Indeed, they are the major funders for the Archeology project, which David will talk about in just a moment. So thank you, Nord Family Foundation, and thank you, yeah. Our program is our rehabilitation is also being funded by the National Park Service and several other smaller foundations, and by you, generous donors. Thank you so much. We couldn't be doing it without this kind of community support. This definitely takes a village. It is my pleasure today to introduce David Klinge. He is the Vice President of the ASC Group, which, as you can see, does cultural and environmental consulting, meaning he's an archaeologist. David got his BA from another small liberal arts college, Dickinson College in Pennsylvania, and he got a master's at the University of Maine, again, in archaeology. We were so fortunate to be connected to David as we discovered that we had an undone portion of our work, which was the archaeological exploration of the site and where it would be disturbed. And David has been out at the site many times. There was a dig made in June last year, 2024, and then again in December 2024, and we'll see him again soon. He has been our sort of archaeology guardian angel, and with that, I will introduce him and he will talk about what he has found in the grounds. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Carol. I assure you it's been absolutely my joy and pleasure to be a part of the project. It's been one of the few really interesting projects that we've been working on lately as consultants. We do an awful lot of work for projects that we spend a lot of time looking at empty holes. So when we get a chance to really spend some time on a meaningful project and a meaningful site, it's really rewarding for us. So thank you to Carol for having me here, for having sponsoring the project, and thank you all for turning out this morning. As Carol mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the archaeology that we've been doing at the Wilson Bruce Evans home. I'm not sure exactly everybody's familiarity with Wilson Bruce Evans or the home. I'm sure that most people in this room are more familiar on both than I. But we'll talk a little bit about him, do some biological background very quickly. We'll talk about the home very quickly. Then we'll get into the archaeology because we don't need to dwell too much on that. And I also apologize for any misspellings, typos, and or technological issues. They're not my fault. Blame Bill Gates. Most of you know Wilson Bruce Evans, born in North Carolina in 1824. He's a free-born African-American. There was actually a fairly sizable portion of free blacks in North Carolina in the antebellum years. But he moved to Oberlin. Moved to Oberlin in 1854. In the years in the decade leading up to the Civil War, a lot of, as you can imagine, tensions in those more northern colonies in the South. Race relations were deteriorating, to say the least. So he and his family and his brother included relocated to Oberlin in 1854. Worked as a number of things: cabinet maker, upholsterer, undertaker, staunch abolitionist, and indicted participant in the Oberlin Wellington Rescue, and lived at the home until he died in 1898. I'm sure all of you know this, but you can stand in the parking lot and look back and see the house right over here on the other side of Plum Creek. Here is the home. A couple of things that bear relevance to why I'm here and the work that Carol and her group have been doing, you all have been participating in. The home built by Wilson Bruce and his brother between 1854 and 1856 And actually, there's two pieces. One, it's listed in both the National Register of Historic Places, and it's a designated National Historic Landmark, and that plays into a lot of what we're doing out there and why we're doing it. Relatively important and kind of interesting, and will bear some fruit later on. Of course, the home has a rear addition, or I should say a second building at the back of the home. Very typical and very common, and I think everybody, including the people who wrote the National Register nominations years ago, assumed that that was an addition to the brick home. Recent research, and I think our work here really reinforces the interpretation that the wooden rear single-story, story and a half building was the original home that Wilson Bruce and his family built and lived in while they constructed the brick home in front of them. And you can just see that off in the back, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later. So what am I doing here? Why are we doing archaeology? As we talked, the aim of the project is ultimately the rehabilitation and the opening of the site to public interpretation. And there are some practical and some just good stewardship reasons for us to be here. Practically, is that federal funding that Carol talked about, right? The project, portions of the project are funded by the federal government. It is a National Historic Landmark. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. This brings into a law that Carol is getting more and more familiar with, called Section 1 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and specifically a little paragraph in there called Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which I think is one of the better pieces of legislation, one of the smartest things our government has done in the last 50 years. I understand we probably have a lot of opinions about smart things the government is doing right now. The National Historic Preservation Act and its twin law, the National Environmental Policy Act, are very good things. What they require is that when the federal government spends some money or it approves a project, that it takes into account how that money, how that project they are funding will affect historic, cultural resources, sites, artifacts of significance, right? So something that is meaningful to the community, to the nation, to the local history. How does that project affect it? We think about that. It just causes the federal government to think about what they're doing. In this case, that includes the rehabilitation of the home, making sure that that work is done to standards that the Park Service has regarding historic rehabilitation. But it also is going to ask Carol and her group to look at and consider impacts to things that no longer are extant on the landscape, right? A home in 1850 and an economic unit in 1850 is different than it is now. There were outbuildings, there were dependent structures, there were things that happened on the property that we need to know about so that we can decide, are we going to affect them? And there were people here that lived here long before Wilson Bruce or any of us were here. And it's very possible that the remnants of those cultures and those groups are on this property, which we also want to know about. That Park Service commitment is to...
We're trying to get you on screen.
Oh, all right. I'll stand back a little bit.
Yeah, use the microphone.
It'll help me, it'll help me.
If you hold the microphone.
Okay, hopefully you can all hear me a little better. Okay, great. That's good. I'm nearsighted anyway, so it'll help me read my notes. So that's one of the reasons that we're here doing the archaeology. That's the legal reason. That's the process that Carol and her group are going through and that we're helping them with. But there's, and more importantly, archaeology is one of those tools, and it's maybe, I think, I'm a little biased, the best tool to address some of those questions that we don't see historically. We have an awful lot of historic information about the Evans family, about the home, about the city of Oberlin. We never have enough, and we never have a lot of information about mundane daily life. We just don't. Those things are not recorded. I mean, we don't write lists of everything we do, everything we eat, every activity that we do today. Archaeology gets us to some of those behaviors and some of those questions. It's also one of the few things that we can do to look at traditionally marginalized voices, whether those are Native American, African American, any dispossessed and marginalized group that does not show up in historical records well. What we're looking for is archaeology is literally the study of those remnants, those broken pieces of those past expressions, trying to piece together something about that. So archaeology here, we have a legal obligation for it. But it's also a really great way to learn more and to fill in gaps and to begin to experience some of those daily moments in the Evans family in Oberlin. So Carol, I don't know if anybody here has seen this slide. I hope I'm not giving away secrets, but there are plans to rehabilitate the facility. One of those requirements is to make the home accessible to the public, would be to make it Americans with Disability Act compliant, so allowing some accessibility additions to the home and providing public restrooms and things like that. So we're going to be adding, there's going to be a small building constructed behind the home to house those facilities, and there's going to be some walkways, and that gray area up there, this is, and I don't know if I have a pointer here, the white structure is the home. There are some white concrete planned walkways. The gray area is a potential parking lot. Hopefully that's a future element of the project. Thank you, Carol. I'll be walking around a little bit pointing at some things, so people on Zoom will miss a few things here and there, but that's all right. We'll have to deal with that. So this really gives us, what we have is the property next door is really, there's the home site, and there are some now vacant properties that are adjacent to it that are hopefully part of the future interpretive elements. But it gives us a lot of space to look at, but we really want to make sure that we're concentrating our efforts on where this project, where those federal dollars are going to be affecting the site. So this proposed design gave us a good sense of what we should be looking for and what other consultants have been looking for. So we really wanted to concentrate behind the home. That big impact, where we know we're going to be having a really big impact, is at the bottom of that white structure. There's a little gray building, there you go. That's the proposed comfort station in addition to the back of the structure. So having said that archaeology is a great way to move beyond some history and get things that history doesn't know, the first thing that archaeology starts with is history, always. We do a lot of research before we dig holes, and we spend a lot of time trying to learn what it is we might see, right? Archaeology is a destructive activity. So when we dig a hole, whatever is there, we're taking it out with us. We're gonna cut through it, we're gonna put it in a bag, we're gonna take it back to our laboratory. We'll never put it back in the ground again the way it was. So we really try to make sure we know what we're hoping to see before we get out there. It gives us a better chance of doing, frankly, of being less deleterious ourselves. We're gonna destroy what we're looking at in order to do the archaeology. So we spent a lot of time doing history mercifully. Carol and her group, the National Register nomination, the National Historic Landmark nomination, the National Park Service have done an awful lot of background work. The historiography surrounding the property is wonderful. So we really spent our time looking at early cartographic maps to give ourselves a sense of what's there. And I don't know if a lot of you have worked with Sanborn Fire Insurance maps, or if you know what a Sanborn Fire Insurance map is. If you're a cartography nerd like me, they are a wonderfully fun way to spend hours and hours of your life. Sanborn Fire Insurance Company started in the mid-19th century, basically drawing a map of every urbanized center in the United States. And they recorded an incredible amount of detail of every building that they could find, what it was made out of, how tall it was, what it was used for, how flammable it was, right? These are maps that were used much like your flood insurance maps today to determine your risk of burning your house down and your neighbor's house in the whole city. They're wonderful resources for what we do. So we started looking at these maps that had been considered by other sources before. I wonder if does my pointer show up there? Oh, look at that. Okay, so hopefully people on Zoom will be able to see this as well. Here is the 1884 Sanborn Fire Insurance map of Oberlin, Ohio. At that time, Vine Street was Mill Street. Here is Plum Creek. We are sitting in the library somewhere up here. This is the Wilson Bruce Evans home right here. It is 27 East Mill Street. As we look at the home, we see that the primary dwelling is brick. That's why it's colored pink. Thank you, Sanborn Fire Insurance map. We have I lost my pointer. We have just below that, we have the rear addition, which is a one-story wood addition. And we can see just south of that, running off the edge of the map, is another structure. It looks very similar to the addition. It's 1 story and wood. As we look into this map over here on the right-hand side, this is the 1893 map, very similar. One thing I do want to point out here, and this is a bit of and something that's come to light very recently, the neighboring property, which is about where, when we talked about that plan, that right about here is where the parking lot is planned. There was another home. As we look in 1893, here is that neighboring home, but we see another building has come up that's identified as a dressmaker's shop. Ooh, let me go back one. Dressmaker's shop. Okay. And again, we see our same building here. If we move forward in time, we're in 1911, something very important happens. Now, we have this building, again, here is our Wilson Bruce Evans home, here is our outbuilding. When we first started looking at these maps, we were just, okay, we've got an outbuilding. That's not unusual in itself. These maps, again, they're very detailed. They'll tell you where every building of consequence that could catch fire is. When we see dependent buildings on a lot of properties, they're just there as a part of that address listing, that 27 Mill Street. On that 1884 and 1893 map, that outbuilding was given a separate address, 27.5 Mill Street. That typically doesn't happen unless there is a commercial reason to do that. If there's somebody that's an occupied structure, there's somebody living there, or it's a commercial address. When we get into 1911, I hope that you can all see this. It may be very small, but we see this outbuilding is labeled with a D in the middle of it, which means it's a dwelling. So it is, at this time this map was recorded, it's being used as a residence. We'll talk a little bit later about what that might be and what that might look like. And then importantly, on the right-hand map, which is a little bit darker, we have the home again. This is 1922. Here we see that building is no longer extant. Oh, I'm really getting ahead of myself. All right. In 1922, that building is gone. So we have a historical record from 1884 to 1922 of a dwelling in the back of the Wilson Bruce Evans home. So that's what we targeted and what an earlier consultant did work on. And that's what we were really looking for and we were very interested in. So the next step that Carol and her group worked with is they hired another consultant, Ohio Valley Archeology, to do a geophysical investigation. Ohio Valley Archeology is one of the premier providers of geophysical work in the country, really, almost globally. They're a fantastic organization. They do some very technical things and they make these beautiful maps, which I won't pretend to be an expert in, but can sort of understand. So what Ohio Valley did was they came out and they did what we call non-destructive work. Again, this is part of that archaeological preliminary work to make sure that we know what we're doing before we dig a hole. They used 2 very accurate and very important pieces of equipment to look at what's potentially beneath the ground surface before we dug any holes. On the left, in the black and white, is a magnetic gradient survey. On the right, in the much brighter colored map, is a ground penetrating radar survey. A magnetic gradient survey, that black and white map, is a really interesting thing. It's a tool that measures the difference in the Earth's magnetic signature between the bottom of the tool and the top of the tool. And it does that for a couple of reasons. There are things that change the local magnetic signature. Iron, obviously magnetic metals, brick, burned things. If you burn a piece of clay, you will impart a magnetic signature on that clay. So construction materials, but also organic materials contain a lot of, and this is where the science begins to get beyond me, I apologize, do provide a magnetic signature. So we can look at, archaeologically, those things pop up as these collection of black and white dots. And black and white dots mean things to the people who are smart enough to do this sort of work, but they can represent monopole or dipolar structures which may tell an archaeologist, hey, this is a reflective piece of metal, this is a modern disturbance, or this is an archaeological, this is an anomaly, they call it, that needs exploration. It may be something worthwhile. It may be a deep pit, a well, a cistern, it may be a foundation. Ground penetrating radar on the right, which I think some of us are more familiar with the idea, is just exactly what it sounds like. It sends a radio signal down into the ground, it measures the reflectivity back up. Things that are hard will reflect, things that are soft, it will let the signal travel through. And again, you need a lot of time looking at what we call slices of ground penetrating radar data to start to tease out some information. But what I can tell you is in all of this work, again, and Ohio Valley is a good provider of this service, they came up with 8 what they called anomalies that they think were associated or recommended or likely archaeological parts of the property. Things that might be out there buried under the ground surface. If we look here, here is the home. If we look in the backyard, where we are going to be looking and doing archaeology, there's a collection of anomalies that we were very interested in. 1, 2, 4 is this long linear anomaly. 6, oh boy. 6 and 8. Those are things that they identified as possibly associated with that not documented building. That sort of hourglass-shaped blob, identified as 6, they identified as likely a rubble. Prior to say that mid-century in the 20th century, when we have readily accessible steam shovels, back when we have Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel, it was really hard to get rid of buildings, and often we just pushed them over and built on top of them. So we see rubble pads like this quite a bit. And so there's a big bit of rubble out there, and that's what they said. We don't know that this is that building, but there's something here that looks a lot like building rubble. 4, that long linear curving line, they thought was a walkway, a pathway. 8, 1, and 2, they identified merely as deep pit features, or something that might be a deep pit. And there are a lot of deep pits on historic sites. Long before we had indoor plumbing, we all had outhouses and privies. Those are deep pits dug in your backyard. They are fantastic archaeological resources. They are used for what they're used for. That in itself contains a wealth of biological data and information that we want on diet and health and all those things. But also when they're done with their useful life, they become a very useful place to throw all the trash. And that's what we're looking for. So we were very excited about those, that none of them turned out to be that, I will tell you that. And then as we got further away from the house, Ohio Valley identified some of these very large features as landscape development features. If you've been out to the property now, there is some real topography in the rear yard. That is natural and has been filled over the years and over the years and over the years to raise that ground surface. So a lot of that, those large features there appear to be associated with that rubble fill that we haven't looked at it archaeologically, so we don't know where it came from. It could have come from anywhere. Again, we focused ourselves looking at the front or the rear of the home. Excuse me. So armed with all that, it was time for us to start digging some holes. And I apologize, this map on the right-hand side is very busy. I tried to clean it up a little bit, but it didn't get done. So I'll try to walk through what it is. I'm also partially colorblind for red-green, so there's a lot of colors up there I will point to that I'm guessing are there still, because my cartographers, I think, do that on purpose for me. But what we're looking at is our archaeological base map overlaid on that geophysical map. And if you can see, the first thing we did, you can see these collection of red dots. These were a series of, and I should say that designing what we did out there and what our work was a collaboration with the State Historic Preservation Office. They had proposed a scope of work to investigate this area. We tweaked it a little bit because as you work in the field, we're working from those historic maps and those radar signatures to guess what we're going to do. As you begin to find things, you tweak that a little bit and you change things as those results begin coming in. The first thing we did was those red dots. Those red dots are very small excavations, much like you see the gentleman in the top left picture excavating. We call them test pits. We're doing a controlled excavation across the whole area so that we can evaluate what the soil looks like, what the stratigraphy looks like. I don't know how many of you are familiar with geology or archaeology in the past have run into stratigraphy. But stratigraphy is merely how the ground has been deposited, how the soil has been deposited. And we use stratigraphy, and we're going to talk a lot, we're going to geek out about dirt here in a little bit. We use stratigraphy to really tell the story of what has happened. In a natural and undisturbed environment, you will see layers of sediment and rock. We've seen wonderful pictures. You drive on the highway, you drive by those cuts, you see all the sedimentary rock. That's the geological history of that area. Culturally, we see the same thing. Every time we touch the ground, we deposit soil, we cut into the ground, we make a record in that stratigraphy that we can read archeologically. So here we're working across that site to take a look and see if there's anything of interest. And what we found in almost all of these tests was 20 to 30 centimeters, just 12 to 14, 15 inches of topsoil with a lot of artifacts in it, and that's wonderful. That is good. We want those artifacts. But those artifacts tend to come in a homogeneous soil lens. They have been moved around. Every time somebody has filled the backyard, every time somebody has pushed a building over, moved things around, they've created this sort of commingled deposit that runs down from the modern day down to some older materials. And so it's good to have those artifacts, good to know what they are, but they're not really in a place or a deposition that we're that interested in archaeologically. We're really looking for things that have been deposited and sealed over intentionally. Those give us a lot more information about what we're looking for. And that 12 to 14 inches yielded to what we call sterile subsoil. And you'll see lots of pictures. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Around here, your sterile subsoil is yellow-gray. If you've all been gardening or planting trees, you've all run into it. It is silt with a lot of clay content. It is soil that was deposited before or during the last glaciation periods in Ohio, right? So we know once we get down there, we can say with confidence, there are no human contacts below this. As archaeologists, we're not paleontologists, we're looking at the humans. So we're looking for the humans above that. So we try to get there. We encountered that in most of our test units. If I can do this without advancing the slide, well, you will see some purple boxes up there and a light white box, dashed box that is about 10 meters by 12 meters. 2 shovel tests that we dug in there, we never saw the subsoil. We got through 70, 80 centimeters, which is about as deep as you can get those little holes and still do meaningful science in them. A very dark black, loosely consolidated sandy fill, packed with artifacts, just packed. I know, Carol, when we were working on this project, they're very hopeful that there wasn't a lot back there to take a look at, but as soon as we dug those 2 holes, I saw Carol and said, we've got some things out here we have to talk about, because somebody had filled that space with artifacts. That's what we could tell at that point. So we then moved on to what are in purple, and I'm going to try to do this without advancing my slides. Where is my, there we go. You can see a purple rectangle here, a purple rectangle here, another here, and one here. These are much larger, we call them units. They are more typical of what you think of when we do archaeology. They are broader aerial excavations, done much more carefully with hand tools, trowels and dustpans and those sorts of things. We moved on to those, and we were looking for, one, those anomalies that we had identified, that Ohio Valley had identified. And 2, we had to explain how we have these 70 centimeters of artifacts in the middle of this backyard.
Has the Plum Creek ever flooded up this time?
That's a good question. I would be surprised because of the topography, but we'll have time for questions at the end. So now this is, it is two very closely paired units. Actually, these units touched each other. They're sort of out of alignment, but I wanted to show you that the soil profile across the top, again, this is where we're going to start talking a little geeky about stratigraphy. These were our first two units, units 1 and 2, and we dig them close together because we want to see, and they're adjacent to each other, because we're looking for that wall of each unit, and we're looking for that stratigraphy and how that soil is laid on top of itself, because that tells us what happened. And we have a couple things. We ran into all the features that we expected to run into and one that we didn't. On the right-hand photograph in Unit 1 facing south, we discovered what what was identified as anomaly 8 in the geophysical was a big deep pit feature. And we thought, boy, this is gonna be our privy and this is great. What we found was a clay drain tile. And we found that it's a downspout that it connects to the back of that white addition. And we found other pieces of it 10 or 20 feet away. It runs off into the hillside. That clay drain tile, very common. That was installed no earlier than 1900. And I know that because it is manufactured, and very proudly so, by the Akron Pipe Company. And the Akron Pipe Company, which they stamped every third or fourth piece of tile, was formed from a conglomeration of tile companies in Akron in 1900. So that feature went in there. Certainly it is an Evans family feature. It is not a Wilson Bruce Evans family feature. But it had been leaking just at the bottom of that photograph. There's a break in the pipe that had been leaking into that bright yellow subsoil, which is that silty clay. Off of the image to the right, sort of over by our curtains in this room, there is a well for the site. And that leaking water had been flowing down, percolating down through that subsoil for 120 years in toward that well, and has created this basin-shaped signature that the radar reflected. So, okay, that was interesting, but not what we were hoping for. The stones on the right, the left of that picture, that are sort of curving, those are that walkway. That is that anomaly 4. We called it feature 2. That is a stone walkway. It connects to the walkway that is visible in bits and pieces along the west side of the home now. And it makes a very nice serpentine path around the feature that we'll talk about mostly today, which is the remnants of that building, that home on the backyard. Moving over into the picture on the left, Unit 2 facing south, we see something we did not expect to see. Now, the previous consultants had identified this area as a lot of building rubble, and that probably masks seeing that stone foundation that is obvious right there. And that's just part and parcel of what we do. That radar signature, those electromagnetic signatures, we're so concerned and so taken up by the material in the fill that it masks this foundation, which we found, and well, we were a bit surprised about. A couple of things to take a look at. And I hope that you can all see this. It is a little difficult. If you can't see it, I'll just promise I'm telling the truth. So here is our subsoil. This is that gray, that yellow-brown silty clay subsoil. This is sterile and devoid of human contact. Here is, on the top of this, and it runs all the way across both of these units, is that modern topsoil. That first 4 or 5 inches, that's your sod and all your modern topsoil. Below that, we do have a thin lens, of brown soil. It isn't quite as dark, and this has started to dry out by the time we took these photographs, so it doesn't show up. It isn't quite as dark as that active topsoil where all that organic activity is happening. But it is browner, it has the remnants of organic activity. That is the historic ground surface when this site was built. It's sitting right on top of the topsoil. That is the ground surface that Wilson Bruce Evans and his family trod upon and built upon. And of note for us here we have our subsoil on the floor, and we have our subsoil coming up the wall, and here's our ground surface. But as you get closer to this foundation, you see this brown earth here. This is a trench that was cut into the ground surface. Oh, let me go back. A trench cut into the ground surface to install this stone foundation. And it's hard to tell here, but it comes up through that historic ground surface and stops just before the modern topsoil and the sod. So we know that that was built after that is built after that historic ground surface was there, cut through it. That's what we call our builder's trench. It's a classic feature. We look for them at all foundations. And what we're really hoping, and I've never done it yet, I'm hoping to find a penny in the bottom of one that somebody dropped in that can tell me this builder's trench was built in 1854. Hasn't happened yet. I've been assured that it will. Really important for us figuring out what was going on in this backyard, and we'll take a good look here at the next slides, is that if you look on the left-hand side of that foundation, you don't see the same stratigraphy. That same soil pattern, it is gone. It does not exist. What we see is, oh, where's my little pointer? Lots of layers of sandy, ashy, charcoal-laden fill that butt up directly to this foundation. There is no builder's trench, but it only goes down at the foundation another 25, 30 centimeters. Excuse me. So here we're looking on the left, we're looking at that foundation and a unit next to it looking south, and then on the right, we've turned ourselves 90 degrees and we're looking at that foundation and that stratigraphy looking to the west. So on the right-hand picture, you can see in the back, up underneath the sod, there are the stones. That's that stone walkway. And in the forefront is that foundation. And this confused me for a little while, when we opened this up. Because I don't know if any of you are builders or tradesmen or have built anything, any structures. That is a terrible foundation. It is not built well. It is dry laid, shape selected field stone, and it has begun to fail and fall towards us on that right-hand picture. It was not built to support a building that stood for very long. Whatever stood on top of that floated every winter, and the doors didn't close for 6 months and the windows didn't close. It's not what we expect to see for a home, particularly as where we are climatologically and culturally. We're in the Western Reserve, we're in a cold part of the country. This is not what we expect. You can also see on the on the left of that, on the right-hand picture, the left side, you can see how thick that fill deposit is that butts up to that foundation. And if you remember, we had our builder's trench on one side, which on the left-hand picture, you can still see you see our foundation, and just at the edge of the frame of our builder's trench. But then our fill runs up right up next to that foundation. So that means that when this foundation was installed, there was a large rectangle excavated. And somebody piled stones around the edge of the foundation, shape-selected stones so they fit together fairly well, 2 courses so they kind of leveled each other out. And then they left it alone, and they built a home on top of that. Again, this is just some more details to see how that works. This is during excavation, so it's a little, the detail shots are probably more illustrative, but a little messier in their imaging. On the left, one thing that's really important to see is on the right-hand side of our foundation, our builder's trench and our subsoil are very prominent, but as you hit that foundation, the fill happens right there. It starts over top of our foundation and then continues and follows down the edge of the foundation. Same thing on the right-hand picture. So when we're looking at this, we're starting to talk about the life cycle of that building, which we're still not sure what it was. We have some historic suggestion that it's a dwelling. But we're looking at the life cycle of this building. And you're beginning to see, oh, where's my little pointer here? So here is our historic ground surface, here is our subsoil and our builder's trench, and right here on top of the foundation is where our fill starts. But there are all these little lenses of fill, and we have this very dark material down at the bottom. So we're beginning to see different layers of deposition of fill on top of this foundation and adjacent to this foundation. And we'll talk a little bit more in another photograph. What I think has happened out here is that we have a building, and the active life and the remnants of this building are here. This building was demolished before 1922. It was probably pushed into the open space that we'll talk about here in a second and left there. But now we've got an empty hole in the backyard. And so a lot of this material, including burying the foundation, was added after the fact, after 1922, to level out the yard, get rid of the hole, and move on with our lives. So as we begin to look at that sort of sequence of construction, we know a couple of things. The building was built before 1884. It was built, the foundation is poor quality, it's not meant to last. We know from the fill on the interior versus the natural soils on the exterior how it was built. We dug a large rectangle, piled shape selected stones around the edge, put a building on top of it that creates a crawl space interior elevated above the subsoil. But it doesn't do what is more common around here. Oh, I should say this. Well, listen, it doesn't do, we'll talk about what it doesn't do in a second. I'll get to that in a second. This is a unit that we dug very farther to the south. It's our purple unit, just off, oh, where's my little pointer? Come back, pointer. Just off the edge of the bottom of our excavation area. And what I wanted to point out was we were trying to find how big this building was. So this is this test unit right here. Up here, our foundation we encountered in this combination of units here. There's our foundation. So we put this unit here, and we're expecting to hit a foundation wall. We did not. But what we did find is, here is our topsoil, here is our subsoil, and then right here, which is directly in line with that foundation, there is a stone that has started to slide. And we started to see the same deposition of material, artifact, rich, dense. I believe that this is the edge of that building that has been robbed of its stone. If you've been out to the property, there is a hill slope just to the west that's a wooded hill slope. If you walk back there, there's an awful lot of building material that's been cast over that hill slope. I don't think that represents an intact building. I think probably you're seeing parts of a lot of buildings that have been sort of tossed off into the weeds over the time. Maybe that's where these stones have gone, maybe they were repurposed elsewhere, but I think that archaeologically we're seeing the edge of that building. So we're beginning to see now, we have a sense that that building was at least, those red dots, those little red dots, I said those are 5 meters apart. So we knew that the building was at least 7 meters long. If we projected it 7 meters, about 21 feet. So we start to get some dimensionality there. So what we know about this building at this point is that we have historic suggestions that it's a dwelling. We have that shallow single course, maybe second course foundation built at the edges of a broad, shallow excavation. It's not built to last, certainly not built how we would build a building here in Northeast Ohio. We're in the Western Reserve. We have a very strong New England tradition of architecture. Most of us probably have full cellars in our house. The brick home at the Wilson Center has a full cellar. I'd love to tell you that cellars were built because they're safe and wonderful places to keep all of our secrets and our jewelry. And the primary function of a cellar, from my point of view, is thermal regulation. You don't see them in the Deep South. You don't see them in Tidewater, Virginia, because they're really not necessary. You see them in New England. You see them in colder climes, because they'll keep you warmer in the winter and colder in the summer. This building was not built with that, even though we are here. It was built in a tradition that's much more reminiscent of mid-Atlantic states, of the Carolinas, of Virginia, of the Piedmont. We do see expressions of architecture very much like this in Ohio, But where I've seen them is in the Virginia Military District. The Virginia Military District is similar to the Western Reserve. It was territory in south central Ohio between the Miami rivers, reserved for veterans from Virginia of the war. And as they settled there, they brought with them a grammar of construction, architectural styles that they're familiar with. They built the buildings that they knew. Whomever built this building, and it was Wilson, he did the same thing here. He brought with him a grammar of construction very familiar to him and his brother. They built a building, not meant to last. It did for 40 years. I posit that one of the other buildings has lasted a lot longer. And it was a temporary structure, but it was purpose-built for, as a residence. It probably has served in the 40 years there, lots of functions. So we look now, this is that rear addition that we talked about, and I think that the current research that Carol and others have been doing are correct. This, I believe, is the original home that was built on site by Wilson and his brother as they built the brick home in front of it. It is, dimensionally, it would align very well with what we see on the maps for the building that we're looking at. If you crawl in the basement, which Carol and her folks are very nice enough to let us do, you'll see there is a full foundation wall on the north side that abuts the brick building, but that in fact, anything that you would consider a cellar underneath there has been excavated after that building was built. It's still standing there. I'll bet you it heaves every winter. I'll bet you it moves. It's the same building that we're looking at. So the building that we were looking at probably looked an awful lot like this. All right, so then we were like, well, that's great. Now we know what we're doing. We know what we found a house in the back, and this is beginning to get really interesting. So let's just take our last photographs, and we'll close up shop, and we'll move on. And I remember saying to our archaeologists here, hey, we're doing our last photographs. There's just some rusty metal that we haven't gotten out of the fill on the floor in the corner. Just clean it up, pull that out, make it look right. So they did that. And as they were excavating, that rusty corner, which in the picture behind us that we just left, is just here. There's a little bit of rusty metal here. And okay, there's some discoloring here, but I was willing to say this had fallen off the wall and got stomped in there by boots, and okay. And as they excavated that little bit of metal, they found this square excavated below our subsoil. Oh, well, that's going to confuse everything. So they cleaned it out, and it wasn't very deep. It went maybe another 15 centimeters, 20 centimeters, so that's 12 inches, 8 inches deep. But it was full of tin canning jars. Tin canning jars are tin plated, they're iron, they were rusted, so they look like rust, and kerosene jars. Long before we all had electric lights, we used kerosene for a lot of things. So we found a lot of kerosene jar lids. And in fact, that's, as you see on the picture on the right, you can see some voids that are sort of falling out of the wall. That's a kerosene jar that was so terribly corroded, as we touched it, it crumbled. The only thing that we could preserve are the tops of that, which are much more robust. Well, this kind of puts some thinking. I had to do some thinking about this. And what we're looking at is a pretty common feature to these temporary buildings. It is an interior cellar space. We might call them an earthen cellar. It probably was lined with wood. That was excavated probably after the fact by whomever was living there, needed a storage space. It's pretty easy to pull up the floorboards, dig a hole, and you have a convenient storage area. It can store your foods, it can keep things clean, it can store your kerosene, it can do whatever you want. We see it frequently, but we really don't see it frequently. Well, we see it frequently in buildings that follow that same mid-Atlantic Carolina pattern of construction. That's where I see it. So if we go back to this map, where's my little pointer? Come back to me, pointer. All right. So this cellar, this red outline is what I think is the outline of our building. This cellar would have stood We just caught the corner of it here, and I have no idea how big it is. We have some plans to find that out. But I suspect it occupied a good portion of the central floor of the south end of that building. We see it very often, we see these earthen cellars, these expedient cellars, often in contemporary buildings. The picture on your right on the top is a home in Clinton County, Ohio, that we excavated several years ago. That's in the Virginia Military District. That's those same people coming up out of Virginia with that same architectural tradition. You can see the stone fireplace base, and right in front of that was an earthen cellar. Much harder to see on the bottom. I'm going to ask you to trust me. You can see some bright orange soil, and you can see some gray soils and clays. If we spend a little time, I promise you those gray soils and clays make a rectangle of about 7 feet by 4 feet. That's in Camp Butler at Springfield, Illinois. That's underneath actually a Confederate prison barracks, where the prisoners, in fact, dug themselves a cellar because they were given food and they had to do all their own cooking and live their own lives. So they dug their own cellar. So it's not a tradition that is unexpected. I kind of didn't expect it here. But what is really interesting, if we go back one and we start talking about the life cycle of our building, and we start looking at this photograph, here we have our subsoil. This is pre-human. Then we see all these different fun colors of soils, and we have our cellar feature over here. There's a line right about here that breaks. And we see, here's this bright piece of subsoil that's different color than the other subsoil. And then this is what confused us. When I asked my excavators to clean this up, this little line of subsoil right here was what they were looking at. We were just trying to clean up this little piece of rust. What has happened over time when this house was abandoned, and maybe before it was abandoned, the cellar was full of storage stuff, those kerosene jars and those tin cans. But it's an earthen cellar, unsupported by much around it. As the weather happens, those walls of that earthen cellar began to slump and break and fall in. And in fact, I think at one point, it slumped and buried all that was in the cellar with subsoil. And that slumping process, as that falls, has broken the stratigraphy above it. So you get this disjoint in the stratigraphy. So I think what I suspect very sincerely is that all the material that's in this cellar, and it's packed with artifacts, it's not very deep, that material was there when the house was used, and when it was in use as a residence. It may have stood there for 10 years after it stopped being used as a residence, but it was there and left in place. It got buried and covered as that cellar began to slump. On top of that, we have this color of material here, this brownish red color that does come across, that sits atop of subsoil. That, I think, is the remnants of the home itself that were either intentionally pushed in or allowed to collapse, probably intentionally demolished because of the time frame that we see in the maps, and allowed to decay there. On top of that, we have fill that was deposited after that demolition. All of those are questions that we will answer definitively at some point, or some other researchers will. But I'm pretty sure that I've got a good sense of what happened out here. The artifacts that we've pulled out of all of these excavations, there are thousands. We have, out of the small number of excavations that we did, we have about 2,500 artifacts. All of which, I believe, originated with the home and with the Evans family. Do I think that all of them originated with Wilson Bruce Evans? I don't. I think probably very few of them did. But they all originated, I think, the material in the home, in the cellar, is there between 1884 and 1922. The material on top of that is material that was in that home when it was demolished. And was that left alone like Pompeii and Vesuvius and then demolished? So it's a perfect daily picture of what happened? Maybe. Was it a convenient place to put all the refuse in the trash for a few years before we got rid of the old shed out back? Probably. So where that stuff came from, I don't know. The stuff on top of that, I think, is probably detritus and material from the home. As we see changes in ownership, as we see changes, transitions from generation, time to get rid of mom's old dishes and buy new ones. And we see that often archaeologically. And so I do think that a lot of that material has originated on the property and the home, but did it originate with the occupants and the people who lived in this house? Probably not. But we'll hopefully get some of those answers as we work on. So now who lived there? And I don't know. I'd love it if you all could tell me. Carol and I have gone around and around with some different ideas about this. I know that she disagrees with some of the stuff here, and that's okay. That's what we do. There are some potentials. We don't really know who lived there. We do know that there is a lot of multi-generationality with the Evans family. In fact, I believe Dorothy Viola, I'm going to get that wrong, was still visiting the site up into the late 1990s. And she is Wilson Bruce Evans' granddaughter, I think is correct. It's very possible the building was built for Cornelius Evans, who is Wilson Bruce's son. He was born in 1856. Sometime around 1884, he would have started to become an adult-ish man. And he may have lived there in the back house. We know he lived on the property for most of his life. He may have lived there in the back house until his father died, and then he moved into the front house. It is very possible that it was used by visiting family, including Sarah Evans Inboard, who came up. They were still living in North Carolina, but she spent many summers, long summers here. It's very possible that it was occupied by her as extra space, as a summer cottage of sorts. Hopefully we get some of those answers as we look more at the artifacts. I'm not sure that we ever will. We're asking very fine questions about very broad data, but hopefully some of that will become clear. So the sort of things that we've been finding these are just a smattering of the types of things, but they're representative of those sort of things that we found. Archaeology finds broken things, we find trash, we love it. The picture on the upper right, I would rail against myself if I were in the audience about this. It's one of my pet peeves to say, look, we found a toy. They were children. Great, right? But I think that's a toy teacup. It's a face. It's very small. You can see the centimeter scale below it. It's for a child's tea set. I thought it was important to talk about here because we do see that multi-generationality at the site. And that means there were always a lot of children around. That means there were always a lot of family, and that's a cultural tradition that I think is kind of important and special. So I thought I'd go against my better judgment and include that. In the upper middle, we have 3 images of the same artifact. That is an ink well that is styled as a schoolhouse. It's a blown glass ink well. They're pretty common. They date very well to the period of time this house was occupied. We found dozens of inkwells and inkwell fragments, and we found master ink bottles. So inkwells back when we were writing with fountain pens and dip pens. You probably could, and I don't know enough, but you probably could buy a filled inkwell at the store, a little one like this, but more often you would buy an inkwell and then you would buy a master ink, which is a much larger bottle of ink, and refill them yourself. We found evidence of the master ink bottles back there. Nobody here wanted for writing materials, right? So this is an engaged and literate and active part of the Evans family experience. On the 2 photographs on the right, the top and bottom, are really interesting to me. We find an awful lot of ceramics archaeologically, just everywhere. Ceramics are very durable artifacts. An awful lot of the archaeological record, again, that trash is not durable. Cloth, textiles, paper, a lot of our material world disappears. Ceramics don't. They last as long, except under very certain circumstances, they last forever. So we find a lot of that, and we found a lot here. A lot of serving dishes, a lot of cooking dishes, but these 2 pieces of ceramic are pretty interesting. These are pieces of Japanese export porcelain. And the bottom one, you can see a maker's mark, was manufactured in Nagoya, Japan, and it says made in Nippon. And that is a very telling maker's mark that was only used on Japanese export porcelain between 1891 and 1921. So export porcelain is kind of interesting. I won't get into the porcelain trade. Suffice it to say that ceramic manufacturers in Asia laughed at us for centuries about our inability to make porcelain. And because we couldn't make it, we loved it. That's why we all have such fine china, and we have such, as we went through some different cycles of we call it opening up the East, which is ridiculous and colonialist and all that, but as we started doing that, they very smartly decided, hey, we can sell all sorts of this stuff to people. So they started making debased versions of their own materials to sell to us, and that's exactly what Japanese export porcelain is. It is porcelain made specifically for sale to Americans and to Western Europeans. It tends to be fairly gaudily decorated. That was something that was important to us. But what's really interesting to me is not that the porcelain itself, what it was, is that it was very much high style when it came out. It was important to have this. Ceramics are one of the premier pieces of conspicuous consumption before we have automobiles, right? Everybody now drives an automobile, and that tells us who we are. We drive a pickup truck or a BMW or whatever we drive. That tells the world who we are. Ceramics very much did that in the 19th, 18th, 17th centuries. So keeping up with the style, keeping up with what was important in fashion was very important. And so the Evans family was not immune to that, was certainly participating in that global national culture, which I think is really important. Right in that 1880s to 1920 time period is when we start to see a global popular culture develop. And certainly these people were engaged in that. Below that, we see some of those tin cans and those kerosene can lids. Again, these were the most prolific things in the cellar. They make perfect sense to me that they were there. But that's just sort of typical of the kind of material that we've been finding. So that's sort of what we know about the home behind the property. That we are still doing some archaeology, we are still doing some minor coordination. Right now, we are looking at and talking about those other structures that the maps show that are on the property. That includes, again, this 1884 map. We have the Wilson Bruce Evans home, and next door we have a residence with an addition. In 1893, we have the Wilson Bruce Evans home. We have that home, it is missing its addition, but we have this new store, which is a dressmaker's shop. It is conspicuously about the same size as the addition that is no longer on that home. It may very well have just moved. That happened often. It may have shifted and been repurposed. That dressmaker shop is not on the 1911 map. And we're just now really starting to work at our survey work and defining what other resources are out there on the property as an inventory for what might be some future work, some directions for hopefully some later engagement with the community in general. And that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to stick around and take as many questions as you have. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Aside from the disappointment of not finding the 1852 coin, did you find any other coin?
I'd have to go back. I don't believe that we did. If we did, we may have found some 20th century coins. People ask us this all the time, and we rarely do. Having said that, in another project, we did just find some cut up Spanish pieces of eggs in southern Ohio, which is the first I've ever seen. Coinage was much more valuable than it is now. It was not dropped often. And if it was, people spent a lot of time looking for it. So we don't see it often. We do occasionally run into it. We may have found an Indian head nickel or something like that. But they would be 20th century coins. Yeah.
Were there any barns, or on the historical map, were there any structures that were labeled as barns?
None that we have been able to identify as barns. There are a handful of other outbuildings that do show up on the maps. They are dependent buildings. They are shed-sized things. We're not sure what their function is. Those are often some of those areas that we didn't explore yet. And maybe in the future, there'll be somebody who'll be able to answer those questions. But nothing that we've found on the maps that show up as a barn. Yeah.
Great presentation. Maybe this is a question for Carol, but are all these findings changing plans for developing rehabilitating? So
So the answer is no, our plans are basically the same, but we will be much more careful about protecting the archaeologically sensitive areas. And with David's help, we've now done this excavation in the area behind where we will be putting our additional building. We'll still go back there, but we now have a better sense of how to treat that with respect. So I think it's informed our process, and we're very grateful for that. Does that help us? Want to say something further?
No, that was great. Garrett?
Yeah, I have an additional puzzle to add into this mix.
All right.
There apparently was a building on the property before Wilson Bruce Evans purchased it. He paid $500 for it, which was a sizable sum. There are maps from 1851 that show some sort of building. So my question has to do, at the same time, if you're describing as we now go on that building, seems to be of a similar type as what you call the rare addition
Right.
to the front building, but it's actually the original part
Right.
of the front building. The addition was brick,
Right.
which we only discovered shortly before you came onto the project. So I'm trying to figure out, was there an existing building and then another building that they added on when Wilson and Henry arrived? Henry's house, we think, was over the workshop that was emerged on South Main Street, and it wasn't there when they arrived. Is it possible that they actually built two dwellings when they first got there? One for Wilson and one for Henry. I'm just throwing this out because I'm trying to understand why the property cost what it did, trying to understand why there was not a Sanborn map, nothing similar as a Sanborn map,
Right.
but a map.
Yeah.
Early on. I'm just wondering whether you have any notion in terms of trying to date that rear building, which seems in many ways to resemble the rear of the existing.
So next question. No, and that's a fantastic question. And I don't know the answer to that. We can get into wild conjecture about what the maps do show us. And I think at this point it would be the maps that I have. We did not see evidence of a building that I would suggest predates Wilson's arrival. The idea that two paired buildings were built for Wilson and his brother to occupy is very interesting and very well could be. There's nothing in what I saw and that we know that would preclude that, other than there's not a whole lot that would preclude that I can say right now. Very intriguing. If we get into that wild conjecture moment, if you track those Sanborn maps more intently than I did when I showed you up here, we have a shape to that building that is rectangular, that in 1911, when it's called a dwelling, it is square. Is it possible that there was an earlier building that was added onto and then taken back? Now we're getting wild conjecture, right? I don't know. It's a great question. Yeah, go ahead.
I think you said that the buildings at that time would be just sort of pushed over the polish like that. Now, would it have been the custom for the owners of buildings to have some sort of sale of furnishings, the property, the utensils? Would it be likely that there's essentially empty buildings when they were knocked down, or would you expect to see some good traces of utensils?
Yeah, really good question. and not one, again, that I have a good answer to. One of the things that we always have to remember is that the human agency plays a part in all of what we do. So yes, absolutely, there are, in general, there are 3 fates to buildings that I look at archaeologically. One, they were moved, and that happens all the time, particularly in the 19th century. Buildings get up and wander around the landscape with regularity. 2, they fall over and degrade very slowly, or 3, they're burned down. And most often they're burned down. They're left to degrade, they get hit by lightning, the wildfire happens. And so I don't see evidence that this building was burned. There's an awful lot of that black ashy material above it that I would want to say represents a burn deposit. But then I would have found all the melted glass and things like that, and I didn't see that. I am sure that yes, one of the things that is very common in a 19th century commercial sphere is a consignment shop, a secondhand shop. A lot of ceramic dishes, again, those conspicuous consumption, those ceramic sets come in and out of style every 20 or 30 years, and we buy new ones because, oh my gosh, the poor people got the same silverware as I do, I gotta get new stuff. And so then we send, we would sell our materials in those consignment shops. So there is that behavior, I'm sure, happened at certain places. I'm sure certain people said, time to push the old building down, we're just gonna do it. What I'm a little surprised about is typically we do see that burned. You see people destroy a building, burn it, and maybe sift through it and pull all the nails and the hardware out that they can use later. We did not see that evidence of that here. So again, some of this is conjecture. The building could have gotten up and wandered around. I don't think it did. I think it's there in the cellar hole. We'll go right here first.
So in about 1979, I took a class with Phyllis Jones, who was an English professor here, on African American women. And she took us to visit a woman who lived in this brick house. I don't remember that lady's name, but she referred to herself and her family as free people of color. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming that's how the Wilson Bruce Evans family thought of themselves. She talked about taking a train to North Carolina, and at certain points they had to get out of go to different cars. Because they were the whites only cars. But I bring this up because I want to ask you if you've referenced historical documents and your archaeological findings, if you had human informants who had lived experience in these buildings, and what have they told you about them?
You are a very, very lucky person. You undoubtedly met Dorothy Inbourden Miller in 1979, who was Wilson Bruce Evans's his granddaughter, daughter of Sarah Jane Evans Inbourden, who was born in the house in 1898, and it was under her stewardship that the house became the National Historic Landmark that it is today. Half the board of today's Wilson Bruce Evans Home Historical Society is descendants of Wilson Bruce Evans. Almost all of them have memories of visiting the house. Most of them also have memories of visiting the Brick School in Enfield, which is where Sarah Jane Inbourden and T.S. Inbourden founded a school in 1895 for Black education. It was at first it was the highest grade of education that could be achieved in that part of North Carolina.
Where is Enfield?
Enfield is north of Tarboro. Okay.
I lived in North Carolina.
So yeah, so lucky you. We do have memories of visiting the house. We don't quite have memories of Wilson Bruce Evans. We have lots of memories of Dorothy Inbourden Miller, who was said to be such a great steward of this property that she not only made sure that all of her nieces and nephews, great nieces and great nephews, sat in the parlor and had tea and history with her. You know, we have these wonderful stories. She is also said to have taken children off the street in her Northwest Washington, D.C. neighborhood and gotten the permission of their parents to bring them to Oberlin to tell them the story of Oberlin and the story of the house. So lucky you. I would love to talk to you afterwards about what you remember. I will say, in terms of other people who have these memories, Alan Campbell has memories of working on the house for Dorothy Inbourden Miller. So there are memories. We do value these. We'd love to hear your memories. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's great.
Oh, and You had asked earlier about whether the house ever flooded. The basement is always, you know, it's an Oberlin house. The basements are always damp. But this house is well above the floodplain.
I remember walking.
It is well above, yeah.
From the sidewalk up to the house.
We had to, we had to document that it was out of the floodplain, and Carrie Porter over at the city was like, must be kidding.
Obviously, you've been digging around the rectangular building that may have been a dwelling, certainly if it contains canning jars. It sounds like there was some heat market. Because you're only at some angles of it, you probably haven't found what that source of heat would be. But I'm curious what it might have been in the 1840s.
Certainly the 1880s, it most likely a cast iron stove, and very likely. So one of the things that we will do, and Carol and the Historical Society have been working very hard with the Park Service and the State Historic Preservation Office to develop next steps and to work through what we're going to do to mitigate our effects to this resource. And as a part of that, when we build the building, when construction happens, we'll be out to take a look at what gets exposed, what additionally gets exposed. And that's one of the questions we look for. Hopefully we would see, ideally you'd see a stone pier that supported that, and I could say, here's the place where they took the weight of the cast iron stove. Cast iron stoves do not have to be markedly heavier than a normal human being, so it's not necessarily true that we'll find a base for that. But that's what it would have been.
Can I ask a follow-up real quick?
Sure, and then we'll get to you just after that. Sure, go ahead.
What more are there further observations?
Well, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here. We have done some additional reconnaissance work. Again, when we look at what the Park Service and the federal government may be spending its money on, they want to have an inventory of what's out there, so they know. So we can make a decision on what's being affected and what's not. So we've done some reconnaissance work to look at those other buildings that we talked about, the dressmaker shop out of the home site. There are bits and pieces of those anomalies from that geophysical work out in the backyard. There are undoubtedly other deposits, refuse deposits and trash deposits and things that are out there. My hope, and I'll talk to Carol about this at some length, and we talked about it a little bit, and I'm committed to things that she doesn't want me to commit her to. My hope is that that we can work at the end of this project to establish a community archaeology program to bring people onto the site with us, with another professional to guide that and keep that exploration going and working there. I think it's a really important thing to do.
Now, is that going to change the funding? Is that going to change with the politics going on now? Or?
Are you asking what's the status of our funding right now? Okay. Are you asking the status of our funding right now?
Yes.
Okay, much to our amazement, our funding has not yet been touched. Let me put it this way. We have two big grants to do rehabilitation. One is they're both from the National Park Service. As of yesterday afternoon, and that's the way we do this these days, right? Neither of those grants had been impacted. Now, what I want to say is those grants together with other funding, some of which we may lose because we have been delayed in our process, are still not enough to do what we need to do. And our costs increase all the time, not only because of the escalation in building costs, but because of additional archaeology and additional engineering plans and whatever. So we're not out of the woods, but we are not sunk deep right now. But don't tell them. We keep our fingers crossed. I check all the time. As of yesterday, as I said, our major National Park Service grants have not yet been touched. But don't tell them.
But they're in your hands, you have the money in your hands. No. These are all reimbursement grants
when we do the work, we're reimbursed for the work. We have not yet been able to access any of that money because we're still awaiting final approval of the comprehensive rehabilitation plan. So we have actually spent 0 public dollars. All of our funding so far to date has been private, to get us to the point where we can use these major federal grants. So for what it's worth, that's where we are. Yeah. And
Right.
yes, I look forward to a public archaeology program. Stay tuned. It is very much in the spirit of the Wilson Bruce Evans House, which is a place where we will all participate in making history, and hopefully making a history that makes for, I will say this, racial justice in Oberlin and more broadly in the nation. It is a time of great anxiety and uncertainty, but we're very clear about our mission, which is to rehabilitate this house, to make it a historic site and a place of public education for the long struggle for racial justice in Oberlin and beyond.
Are the artifacts being saved in general?
Absolutely, right, yeah. So a lot of those questions where I said, well, I don't know, and yes, maybe, and then somebody will find out. Yeah, the materials here will be curated, some of which we intend to curate and display on site. But an awful lot of them will go either to the State Historic Preservation Office or even to the Midwest Archeological Center in Lincoln, Nebraska. Unbelievably, that's where the Park Service does its archaeology for the Ohio, which is the Midwest. And they'll be available with all of our notes, all of our records, all of our everything, so that researchers in the future who want to spend the time and want to ask better questions than we can ask, or have a different set of questions to ask, can use those and look at those and come up with more information. Yep.
Should we wrap this up? Thank you all for coming. Thank you, familiar faces, unfamiliar faces. I'm happy to meet you, talk to you, grab me after this. And thank you, David, so much for all you've done in the long term and for today's presentation.
Well, thank you. It's
David,
really
Don't forget to sign in.